Hi everyone, Christina here. Welcome back for another card video at my YouTube channel and blog. Today I'm going to be using two stamp sets from Simon Says Stamp. These are brand new stamp sets. One is called Incredible Woman and the other is called Good Job Mama, which is designed by Kathy Zielske. I'm going to be using some Zig Clean Color Wheel Brush markers today, and I find the best paper to use with these markers is Strathmore Bristol paper. I find that the marker colors really blend well on Bristol paper, so that's why I'm using this type of paper today. I've taken both pieces of Bristol paper that I trimmed out and taped them to a hard board. This is so that I can pick up the board and tilt it as I paint, and also so that it stays completely flat while I work. I'm using 6 different colors of markers: peacock blue, lilac, turquoise green, yellow, light carmine, and pink. And I started out by putting a layer of water on one of these backgrounds. I'm going to be painting the one on the left first, and I started by bringing the marker directly to the paper and then kind of softening it out with a watercolor brush just to get it to have softer edges. And I did this with a couple of the colors, and then I realized that it wasn't getting enough saturation of the marker color. So then I decided to scribble the markers out onto a slick surface. This is a watercolor palette from Art Impressions. So I scribbled those out on the palette and then picked them up with a wet brush. And this was just a little bit of an easier way to get those colors to my surface so that I could blend with them. So I'm putting one layer of all of these colors down, and then I'm going to grab my heat tool and dry this entire piece here. If you don't have a heat tool like this, you can definitely let it air dry. I was just a bit impatient and wanted to speed up the drying process. After everything was dry, I came in with those same colors again, and I did another layer of color. And because I used that dark blue and the turquoise straight to the paper, I did have to scribble them onto the palette so I had them to work with. So I'm going over those areas with the same colors, trying to get an intensified color area. Also, I'm creating these really pretty harsh edges that is very, it's kind of like a signature look for watercolor pieces. And I really wanted to have those harsh edges. So now I'm going to move on to the second panel, making sure my tape is all pressed down really well. I'm going to scribble out all of those colors, all 5 colors actually, onto my palette here, or 6 colors, I'm sorry. I'm going to put all of 6 colors out, and then I'm going to start painting. So this time I want to keep the colors more concentrated to the center. I don't want it to go edge to edge. And I'm painting directly on in the same order that I have them on the palette. So it's a little bit like a circular rainbow effect, but I just want that area in the center. So I'm hitting this or drying it with my heat tool. Like I said before, you can definitely let this air dry. You don't have to use a heat tool. And then I'm coming back in using the same technique, just that same color over the top of each area, kind of blending those colors together, trying to intensify the color. So these markers, they do tend to water down quite a bit, but the brightness stays, which I like. So after I had all of that dried, then I'm going to use a little bit of water in a spray bottle and reactivate these marker colors. So I'm using a Tim Holtz Distress sprayer, and I sprayed it into the palm of my hand, and then I'm flicking that water down onto the dry watercolor. And what this does is wherever that water hits, it's going to reactivate that pigment underneath, and then I can pick it up with a paper towel, and I get this really cool, almost bleached watercolor effect. So I'm going to take a paper towel and just place that over the top and lift it up, and it lifts up all of that ink from the markers. This is a really fun technique. I use this all the time. It's one of my most favorite things to do with watercolor backgrounds, and these Zig Clean Color Wheel Brush markers work beautifully with it since they do reactivate with water. So I decided to do the same spray sprinkle technique on the other background just because to me it looked like it needed a little bit more detail, so I thought these small water droplets would be perfect. I also spritzed it with my spray bottle just a little bit just to get some smaller droplets. After everything was dry, I then placed each of these backgrounds into my MISTI stamp positioning tool and did a bit of stamping. Using from the Incredible Woman stamp set, the large greeting area that says Mother vertically, and I'm going to prep the area with an anti-static powder tool. This is the powder tool from EK Success. Just rub that across that area, and then I'm stamping in Versamark ink. Versamark ink is very sticky. It's perfect for embossing powder, which is what I'll be using today, because I want this stamped image to be in white. So I'm stamping that down, walking my fingers over that large grating, and then I'll use some Brutus Monroe Alabaster embossing powder. It's a nice bright white embossing powder. So I'm sprinkling that on, tapping off the excess, and then using that same heat tool that I used before for drying my watercolor. This time I'm using it to heat up this embossing powder. And it heats it up till it's melted, and then I'm going to stamp this another time. So my plan for this particular image is cutting them out in individual strips for each word. And then I can mix these together. That's why I want this stamped multiple times on this background. I want it so that I can kind of take the first word from that first stamping and take the second word from the second stamping and sort of get a little bit of a more random color effect. So I had all of that stamping done. So I'm going to come back to the other card, and this time I'm going to use the Good Job Mama stamp set, and I'm just going to stamp this greeting that really simply, one of the one that says Good Job Mama, and then underneath it says, I can't remember what it says. So it says, you got this. Good job, Mama, you got this. And I stamped both of those images in Versamark ink, just like I did before on that other card design, and then used some alabaster embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Once again, I'll just heat set that until it's smooth and melted. So I'm going to set that one aside while I go back to this first one, and I'm cutting apart all of these little strips. And I realized that there was an area at the very bottom where I wanted that same image over the blue, so I did end up stamping that image a third time off camera, and then I used it for my for the finished card. So after I cut out all these strips of the words, I kind of mixed and matched them, trying to figure out how I wanted this to look, if I wanted some of the colors to be next to each other or if I wanted them to be really random. And this is the kind of grouping that I came up with. So the area that's going to go behind these strips of words, I wanted it to be white, so those the watercolor would really stand out, but I didn't want it to be just plain white. So I'm actually going to use this gemstone embossing folder from We Are Memory Keepers, and this is a really deep impressions embossing folder. So in order to prevent the cardstock from cracking, I spritzed it with a tiny bit of water that will just soften up the paper enough so that it won't crack as I put it through my die cutting machine. And when you're using those really thick embossing folders, you just have to remember that it takes place of one of your cutting pads. So I just used one of the cutting pads instead of two and ran it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, and it embossed it beautifully. Then put some foam adhesive behind each one of these words, and then adhered it directly down onto the card front. And there was one thing that was kind of bothering me when I was finishing this up. It was that it wasn't obvious that it said Mother vertically. So I grabbed another one of those Zig Clean Color Rope Brush markers, and I just painted over each one of these letters. And I liked it, but in the end, you'll see I'll come back and I'll soften it up even more. So I'm going back to that other card and putting some Tombow Extreme adhesive on the back of the watercolor panel. I trimmed that down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, by the way, and then I put it down onto this card base. The last thing to do to finish this particular card is add a little bit of sparkle using some crystal sequins from Darice. Using some Gina K Designs Connect glue to glue down all of these sequins. And then I'm going to go back to the first card, kind of switching back and forth between these cards today. Like I mentioned before, I wanted to soften that purple shade, so I'm coming in with a very small brush, adding water, and then picking it up with a paper towel. So similar to that technique I did earlier, but this time I'm using it in a more mindful way by placing the water in areas where I want it to lighten the watercolor. So that just softens that color, but it still leaves the definition, so it's a little bit easier to see that vertical word reading Mother. So those are the cards for today. Hope you guys enjoyed. You can get both of these stamp sets over at simonsthestamp.com. They're perfect for Mother's Day. Even that Good Job Mama stamp set has some sentiments that would be great for sending to your friends, or not necessarily your mom on Mother's Day, but other mothers that you'd like to support. Thanks so much for watching today. I'll be back very soon with another card video.